today's Press Freedom Day comes as Ukraine is under attack. I've just gotten back from Ukraine. There are obviously a number of our colleagues, both Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian alike, who have lost their lives during this conflict, which for now shows no sign of ending. On a personal note, I've just come here from the CNN Bureau. I ran into the parents of Austin Tice, a fellow journalist who has been missing in Syria for the past almost 10 years. He disappeared in August of 2012. They are remarkable people who are doing everything they can to bring their son home. It hits me particularly hard because I used to cover Syria and travel into Syria, doing many of the same things that Austin did when he was captured. We often talk about press freedom in the context of other countries, foreign countries, beyond America. But of course, we also have to consider what is happening here in the United States. In the time that I've been back in the United States, I have had to deal with these issues up close. I was there at the Capitol on January 6th when my team and I were attacked verbally, physically. One of my panelists and colleagues out here tonight, Donie O'Sullivan, was also out there. That was an extraordinary moment in American history, and one that obviously has to be talked about in the context of press freedom as well. As I mentioned, in Ukraine, there's not just the physical war that is happening, there's also a disinformation war that is very much underway, that grew both in the lead up to that conflict, but also continues today, both inside Ukraine, where Russia has tried to get out their version of the facts, and of course inside Russia, where it is increasingly difficult to get access to the truth, where a growing number of independent media outlets have been shut down, journalists have been arrested, and of course threatened and silenced. So we're going to be talking about all of that tonight. So with that, I would like to bring out my panelists for this evening. The first is CNN's Donie O'Sullivan. He is a CNN correspondent who covers the intersection of politics and technology. And the other is Jason Rezaian, a global opinion writer for The Washington Post and the host of the Spotify podcast 544 Days, which chronicles the time that he spent jailed in an Iranian prison and what it took to get him out. So let's please give them a round of applause. So I'm just going to kick things off with a couple questions for these guys, and then we're going to get to some of the questions that you all submitted. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion because these are two gentlemen who I respect enormously and who have done such tremendous work over the past few years. Jason, I want to start with you and talk about what you've experienced versus the moment that we're in right now. You recently wrote about Russia's silencing of journalists, how in that silencing, disinformation arises. Can you compare what we are seeing in Russia right now, the silencing there, with what you saw and experienced yourself in Iran, which we so often talk about as an example of a place that has no real free press?
So thank you so much for the question, Alex, and I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Today is World Press Freedom Day, but every day should be World Press Freedom Day. It's that important, and I'm glad that people care. So good on you for being here with us. RSF put out their annual report, Press Freedom Index. Iran ranks 178th out of 180 countries. It's a horrible place to be a journalist. The only two that are worse are Eritrea and North Korea. But that being said, the disinformation that Russia produces, publishes, broadcasts to its own citizens makes what the Iranians are able to do pale in comparison, because they are so professional at creating false narratives. And unfortunately, those false narratives have a tendency of affecting how democracies, functioning democracies, including our own, operate. So I would say that as horrible as my experience in Iran was, as censored a media landscape as it is, the threat of Russian disinformation and propaganda is much greater than anything that the Iranian regime is able to create.
When you get a sense that you're going to be under threat because of what you're doing, what you're reporting, as you feel, things closing in around you in terms of the authorities, what does that feel like? How do you balance your need and desire to get the news out, what you're reporting, versus your own personal safety?
So, I lived and worked in Iran for 5 years before I was arrested. With full permission of the Iranian state, I understood very well what the red lines were, what I could and could not safely report on, where I could and could not go. Here in the United States and in Western Europe and in democratic countries, you're not going to make those kinds of compromises as a journalist that, okay, I'm not allowed to report on this, so I'm not going to report on them. But in a place like Iran, you understand that it's the difference between, one, having your ability to operate in that country taken from you, two, potentially your freedom. And so, news organizations, whether it's the Washington Post, CNN, New York Times, and a whole host of others, make the calculation that it's better to have feet on the ground in those places reporting to a limited extent rather than being shut out entirely. For those of us who live and work in those kind of atmospheres, the stress level is constant, but it's always at a low hum. For me, in the days and weeks ahead of my arrest, it was starting to build. First it was hacks into my social media and email accounts. Next it was being followed around Tehran, the city where I lived and worked. Until finally my wife and I were arrested at gunpoint in our home, hauled off to prison, handcuffed, blindfolded, and thrown into solitary confinement, accused of spying for the U.S. government, and really thrown into a state of shock that now, almost 8 years later, is just starting to dissipate. So I think you have to steel yourself and prepare yourself to work in those kinds of countries in the same way that you do when you walk into a conflict zone, which you know all too well. The threats are very real, but we make the decision that doing this work is that important, and we're committed to doing it.
Doni focuses, as many of you know, on a lot of the disinformation in this country, a lot of what happens on social media platforms. As I mentioned, Doni was also out there on January 6th. He travels all around the country speaking to people about a whole range of issues. I want to show a quick clip of some of his work, and then we'll get to ask him some questions.
It's been a year since the attack on the U.S. Capitol. It's been a year since the attack on the U.S. Capitol. And because of disinformation, denial, and diversion, Americans don't have a shared history, a shared understanding of what happened here on that day.
I think the whole reporting of it is a giant hoax. We are very peaceful people. So it was a total setup. To me, it was the FBI had set it up. I don't believe that they were Trump supporters that did that.
You said the whole thing's a setup. You don't really believe that, do you?
I do. I do. Because Trump won the election. They've proven it over and over again.
I spoke to Trump supporters at two recent events held by the former president in Florida.
I think that it was set up, and I think that people didn't know what was happening, and I think that they went in there and they were caught in a trap, if you will.
You're suggesting that January 6th was a setup?
Yes, I am. Mm-hmm.
But you would acknowledge there was a lot of Trump supporters involved in the violence that day.
I didn't see any Trump supporters in the violence. I saw people that pretended to be Trump supporters in that violence.
Pretty wild things. I think when we talk about the timeline of disinformation in this country, a lot of people look to 2016 and what the Russians did in that election. So much of what we see now here in terms of disinformation is domestically produced. It's as if Americans took that Russian playbook and sort of ran with it. So you go out and you speak with people who believe all kinds of things, a lot of which are not founded in any real truth. So what do you see as your mission, or what you're trying to accomplish through your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent, I guess, 7 years now covering online misinformation and disinformation. And for the most of that time, I spent covering it from behind a computer screen, as most misinformation reporters do. And it was actually when our colleague Jim Acosta was out at one Trump rally in the summer of 2020. I think it was when Trump started doing rallies again. And it was a partially indoor rally, and people weren't wearing masks. And I think Jim was asking people, you know, why aren't you wearing a mask? And a lot of people started saying, there is no COVID. This is all a hoax, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when I started asking my bosses to say, look, I really want to go and ask the follow-up question to say, where are you getting this information? Not only to do that, but just to have people, and many Trump supporters have, open their Facebook feeds for me and show me where they are getting this information, this misinformation, disinformation. So for me, I mean, I'm just kind of fascinated by how people arrive at the conclusions they arrive at, and figuring out where in their information diet that a lot of this junk is coming from. And I think, you know, you kind of see in those clips there, look, some people we speak to kind of know better, and people have, of course, their biases, and they want to believe what they want to believe. And some people know that, you know, what they're saying about January 6th, no Trump supporters being there, is a lie. And it's a political talking point. But other people I meet genuinely, really, really believe that.
You are almost certainly not going to get arrested for what you do in this country. And if you haven't seen it already, Trevor Noah gave a terrific speech about this at the White House Correspondents' Dinner this past weekend. But there is certainly hostility towards many in the press in the U.S. and in particular at CNN and some of the places that you go to. How do you confront that hostility? How do you manage it? What's your approach?
Well, the Irish accent helps for sure. No, I mean, on a serious note, I will say we have found ourselves in some sticky situations. Obviously, January 6th, you knowing better than anyone else, really, with that. But you know, I have found for the most part, I approach these conversations with Trump supporters in that I genuinely want to figure out what it is they believe and why they believe it. And try not to speak down to anyone. You know, I genuinely want to figure out why they arrive at this point. And, you know, we do a lot of these stories, and a lot of people on the left will say, oh my God, you know, you've exposed them for being fools, et cetera, et cetera. But I've stayed in touch with quite a few of the people we've interviewed. And they say, okay, well, you said what I was saying was false. You explained it was misinformation. But they said, well, we kind of expect that, but they're thankful that we've made the effort to come and speak to them, to not cut up their clips in a way that's, you know, misrepresents what they say, and that we've kind of made the effort to travel to the back end of Alabama on a Saturday afternoon to speak with somebody in a field for 25 or 30 minutes.
So they're generally happy with the way that you portray them, and
yeah, I mean, you know, they certainly, you know, they certainly, it doesn't change their world view, I don't think, but I don't really view that as my role either. My role as a reporter is to go and find out what, you know, in this case, what people believe, why they believe it, and to share that story.
Jason, you know, you were in Iran, and I spent a lot of time covering the Middle East as well, and I think in places like that, people do go to very specific places to get their information. Those silos, which we are seeing more of these days. What do you make of the landscape now in the United States in terms of how people are getting and digesting their information?
Well, I think it mimics a lot of what's been happening in the Middle East and other countries that have been moving in authoritarian directions, especially long-established democracies like India, like the Philippines, where Facebook and other social media platforms have become the main source of news for people, and without any kind of regulation, any sort of information that one wants to publish can be disseminated. And as Doni has seen, that's starting to happen here in the United States as well. I don't think we're immune to any of it. And so for me, when I write stories about the U.S. now, I always think that my reporting skills and resources that I learned as a foreign correspondent are as applicable here in the United States in a different kind of way than they would have been before. And I would, say that anybody that's looking to cover the U.S. and politics in the U.S. and different communities here should take that approach to it. Definitely not talk down to people, but at the same time, really trying to hear them out. What's going on? And although it might be impossible to put oneself in the shoes of somebody who believes that sort of misinformation and disinformation, you got to try.
I want to get to some of the audience questions, and this one is from Lizzie. And Doni, to you first. We spend so much time discussing, especially in light of this recent purchase, soon to be purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk, and how he would see the regulation of that platform. Lizzie wants to know, what direction would you like to see platform regulation go as it relates to journalism in particular?
I certainly wouldn't be qualified to write the regulations, but what I would say is, even without laws and regulations, but it's becoming more and more clear that there has to be something because these platforms seemingly won't act otherwise, there's a lot to be said for, and Elon Musk has actually been saying, Elon Musk has been saying a lot of crazy stuff, but he's also been making some points in roundabout ways that are helpful in that to have some degree of transparency about the algorithms, right? Because it's still a black box. We don't know really what makes stuff go crazy on Facebook and in what way Facebook is pushing this content, right? And Facebook will roll out many explanations and they'll say we're doing X and Y and Z, but then every time you log onto the platform, if it was Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, revealed documents that Facebook's own research internally found. I think they set up an account to look like a mom in South Carolina or North Carolina, and liked a few conservative pages, liked a QAnon page or two, and all of a sudden it was Facebook recommending to that person more QAnon content, bringing them down further and further down the rabbit hole. So transparency, I think, about that. I don't think, and not necessarily there ever should be, government regulation on these tech platforms about speech. Obviously, that would go against the First Amendment. But I do think the smart conversation to be had is about the amplification on the platforms.
Jason?
Yeah, I wanted to also add, though, that I think that there does need to be much more effort and care put into upholding the rules and regulations of the platforms, especially around hate speech and libel. I consistently continue to get accused of being a spy for the U.S. government by Iranian Twitter, and that's not true. That's never been founded. That it's sullies my reputation. There's nothing I can do about it. When I report these tweets, absolutely nothing happens. The response is always, Twitter has deemed this in compliance with our norms. They've got to get much better at that. One of the things that I've heard that Elon Musk has been talking about also is the idea of making every account a verified account, right? Attaching it to an actual human person. I think maybe that's not a bad idea. More complicated than it sounds, probably. But there is a lot of work to be done, and I think while I agree that the fundamental principle of free expression has to be cherished and respected, we can't let people take advantage of it to propagate hate crime and other forms of libel against people.
And just piggyback on those 2 points, you know, you're a high-profile journalist at one of the biggest newspapers in the world. For many people, especially women on the platform who are just private citizens, when they get harassed, they have absolutely no recourse at all whatsoever. And I do think, and believe me, I am not on an Elon Musk bandwagon here. You can see on his Twitter, he is flirting with the alt-right and saying really quite worrying things. But on the point of verifying users on a platform, so many people I have spoken to who want to engage, especially women, online in political discourse, they feel like they can't because there's so many anonymous trolls pushing them off it. So when you come to that free speech argument, there is something there that I think could be remedied by having people verify who they are.
When you guys look at social media, do you look at it as, you know, are they all lumped together, or are there companies that are doing more than others? Donici first.
Definitely. I mean, the companies kind of vary, and even within Facebook, there are teams that do good work and there are teams that kind of deflect. Facebook has a pretty good team now after 2016, when they had no idea that Russia was running a disinformation campaign posing as Americans. They kind of got on that, and they have a team now that is, you know, revealing a lot of these state-backed, in Iran too, campaigns. But certainly the platforms vary day to day. I would say Twitter normally has been a little bit more transparent, but it ebbs and flows. And also then there's the bigger point of which gets we don't cover it enough, frankly, is, you know, we talk a lot about the open platforms, but of course then there's spaces like WhatsApp where there are family groups or there are bigger groups with dozens or maybe up to 250 people or so. And a lot of stuff gets disseminated in there, and that there's no kind of recourse for that at the moment.
It's all
Or Telegram as well, which you know, which can have much larger groups.
So many of the U.S. conservatives and the alt-right moved to Telegram after January 6th here, when they got quote unquote deplatformed from the likes of Twitter.
And it's a worrying trend when you know that that's the preferred platform of Russians, Iranians, and Chinese.
Jason, but speak to the, you know, overseas, and it's in particular in places where there's only state media and there's no real independent media, people are much more reliant on the social media platforms in order to get the actual news.
Well, which makes it that much more essential for some sort of regulation. I mean, I think these ecosystems are so vast and hard to monitor, hard to control, and then bring in the fact that you have communities in literally hundreds of different languages, right? Yeah. There aren't teams at Facebook and Twitter monitoring the content of every single language out there. That's just not feasible. It should be, but it isn't. And I think that, you know, for the sake of healthy news consumption, we have to figure all of this out, but it's not happening. And I think that the ways that misinformation and disinformation are being spread and amplified are incredibly concerning.
I will say that, you know, not to totally pile on the platforms, you know, one effort that Facebook did make and put in a lot of money was hiring independent fact checkers, third-party fact checkers. They've hired tons here in the US. They work with the likes of Reuters, PolitiFact, many other outlets, and they've done it globally. And when they really started rolling this out, I guess around maybe 2020 or so, maybe before that, but you know, we kind of covered it in the technology press as like they're doing this thing. You know, it's gonna, if you share something that's false, Facebook might label it with a fact check and say, here is the real information. I was stunned when I started going out into the field and asking people at Trump rallies about Facebook. Everybody on the tip of their tongue had these fact checkers. They were like, oh yeah, my stuff gets labeled all the time as false. But they were talking about the fact checkers in the way that the kind of mainstream media has been demonized. But that demonization happened so quickly. And, you know, for many of the folks, these fact checks, something that says, well, what you've shared here is false, whether it's false claims about the election or not, kind of became badges of honor. It was gamified. So, you know, even when the platforms try to make an effort, possibly with some of the target audience, it gets flipped on its head.
Jason, and we are obviously at a university and in a school of media, and I think many of you are probably interested in going into this industry. And one of our audience members has asked whether the growing number of journalists captured or killed overseas has had an impact on people choosing to follow this career path. And I would just follow that up with asking, should it have an impact?
Look, I mean, I think it certainly should have an impact. In my skewed point of view, as somebody who was a journalist who was imprisoned abroad for a long period of time, it's made me want to double down on this profession. And I think it's an important calling. And if people feel pulled towards telling stories of communities and places that they may or may not have access to or would like to know more about or believe are underrepresented, that's a noble thing to do. I think it certainly had an impact. I will say, though, that, you know, the three of us have been in very difficult reporting situations. I can only speak for myself, but I never wake up in the morning and want to go out and get into trouble or get hurt or see somebody else get hurt, right? That's not why we do this. It's not for sensationalizing the strife and hardship. It's for getting information out to people that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. And in a lot of ways, I think we are witnessing some of the best journalism ever right now in different formats, different ways of storytelling that didn't exist previously. My concern is, unfortunately, it's maybe having less of an impact than it did in the past. So that's a kind of a strange dichotomy, that the work that's coming out right now is so damn good. But there's so many competing platforms, ideas, points of view, and people attacking what we do that it's not having the same kind of impact that it should.
But Donnie, you raised this earlier. You know, you're speaking with people who aren't necessarily going to believe what you tell them. So to Jason's point, even if you've got some terrific journalism out there, do you believe that some are lost? How do you break through?
Yeah, it's pretty disheartening, you know. And I would say that I often see times too when I just share on my Twitter feed, maybe reporting from our White House correspondents of something when Biden messes up or something the White House might have not done right today. I'll have liberal followers, Democrats, tweeting me, sometimes quite vile stuff, attacking me for saying, why are you sharing, why are you attacking Biden? So I certainly think the issue is far more pronounced in the US at the moment on the right, but because there is such polarization, and because in the world of Twitter and online people get into their camps, people on the other side of the aisle too are being, I think, programmed almost into thinking, no, we only want to also consume the news we want to hear. And that, I think, it's messed up.
Alex and I grew up at a time in this country when households oftentimes still got 2 newspapers, right? So that you knew.
TV channels.
And, yeah, exactly. 3 TV channels.
They had TV back when you were a kid? Alex is actually this anti-aging cream. It's incredible.
But, the idea was that you wanted to know what the people that didn't think like you do think. We don't want that anymore, right? We want to be validated for our points of view. And choosing to try and understand how other people think that are different than us takes a real discipline that I think has been dissipating in recent years. And I think a function of that has to do with with how social media sort of rewards us for creating content that other people applaud. And it's not just us in the media, right? You know, a lot of people out there are like hunters, right? And I'm not talking only about young people or middle-aged people, you know, people across the spectrum. Everybody wants to believe that their point of view is valuable and has support. And unfortunately, I think we have to extricate ourselves from that, and that's going to be a hard thing to do.
I want to go back to this question about personal safety. January 6th was one day, and I think no matter how long I'm a journalist, it's going to go down as one of the most extraordinary moments that I've ever covered. And, you know, I knew that there was going to be some animosity towards journalists in general, and perhaps CNN in particular that day, so I kind of kept my distance early on in what was then still a protest. And then as it turned into a full-blown riot, I got a little bit closer, my team and I got closer, and that's when they figured out who we were. They turned around and turned on us. And I think what was most jarring and shocking was that this was not something that I was covering overseas, where I'd been in plenty of hairy situations and uprisings, but it was in the town that I live in, getting screamed at and threatened, saying things like, "We will effing destroy you," in English, and you know, in my mother tongue, and then to leave at the end of the day and take a cab and go 5 minutes home was it was really just extraordinary. And I ran into Donny at the end of that day, and actually did something that wasn't very cool. I had a hat on, and I was, you know, big jacket, and I had a mask as well, and I went right up to him, and you know, I could have been anybody, and I could see this sort of alarm in his eyes.
I had forgotten about that, so thanks. Yeah, that was great.
But that's a very long way of asking. I think so much of the country was shocked by that day. A year and a bit later, a lot of the country now is downplaying the importance of that day. But Donny, you travel around this country more than either Jason or I do for work. Do you think that hostility towards the press is getting worse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that. Look, I think like the kind of chant sometimes that, and people say it to my face. You know, we go to Trump rallies, and there's a lot of people who tell us, F right off, don't want to talk to us, and that's fine. Then there's other people who will do these Trump-sponsored chant of, you know, CNN sucks, but then they'll have a conversation with you. And you kind of realize that for a lot of folks, that it's all a bit of theater, and they don't take it as seriously. They'll still have a conversation with us. They still might even watch CNN. But there obviously is plenty of folks that take it to the extreme. I mean, the guy who sent mail bombs to CNN, the people that you encountered on January 6th, and also our colleagues Ellie Reeve and others. But I think there's something to be said for the people in the middle, the people who kind of view it as a joke, but still show up. That's the mob mentality. That's the masses that showed up on January 6th, the kind of physical manifestation of the online mob. It's those people that sort of say, oh, you know, CNN sucks, but maybe they won't necessarily act. But they kind of allowed, you know, the real instigators of the violence. They gave them cover, and they allowed them to move into the Capitol, the people standing out on the lawn. Many people who were on the lawn that day or out on the streets wouldn't commit violent acts themselves, but they certainly were quite sympathetic to maybe some of the people who accosted you. So I think that's kind of like where that I find a little, you know, in some ways almost more disturbing than the guys who go right for the violence. It's the people, the very kind of normal people, and people that you'd have living on your street, people who could be in your family, your cousins, that's kind of just not giving a damn about a lot of this stuff, you know?
Yeah, it is important to note that diversity. I mean, it's certainly there were all kinds of people who were out there that day, some who just, you know, were taking it all in. I've been to Trump rallies where, same thing, I've waded through the crowd and people would come up and say hi. And I think if our colleague Jim Acosta were here tonight, he'd tell you about all the selfies that he's taken at Trump rallies, because people love to talk to him. and say hi, and you know, they love the sort of back and forth that he's had with former President Trump. Jason, back to, you know, sort of younger people and getting into this industry. Krupal, who I assume is a student here, wants advice on how people get into storytelling through interviewing, and especially here in DC. And I would, again, add something. How would you get into it given the sheer number of outlets these days?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, you're at a wonderful institution for learning the best skills. I was a Turker Fellow here a couple of years ago. I actually lived on campus right here on 21st Street for 2 years, and it was an amazing experience in that I got to engage with students from all over the country and all over the world who were hungry to learn, but also to engage. And I think you've got the greatest classroom in the world right outside your doors here in Washington, D.C., but also in the surrounding area. You have communities of immigrant populations from all over the world, right? So, you know, I often like to get out and talk to people who come from parts of the world that I know nothing about. You know, these days with the war in Ukraine, I'm seeking out Ukrainians to talk to get their perspective. People that live locally and people that have been passing through recently. Also, Afghan journalists who've been you know, exiled and are now living in the United States. I spent a lot of time talking with them. And I also think just honing your skills first and foremost as observers and listeners, right? Frank Sesno, who was a professor here and was the director at SMPA for a lot of years, used to teach a class in interviewing skills. And, you know, I think the most important thing that I learned from sitting in on that class was just listening, right? And it's not something that in this media landscape, in this political landscape, we are being encouraged to do. And I want to give you all the encouragement to do that. Listen better. You know?
Tony, you have a great origin story, how you got to CNN, because you were a big fan of CNN's when you were outside the company, and now you're one of the company's biggest rising stars.
Oh.
So how did you get your start? and similarly, what advice would you give?
Yeah, I mean, I was always kind of obsessed with social media, and I worked with got lucky, I got an internship with a company called Storyful. When I got out of college, it was an Irish company that verifies the videos and images that pop up on social media during breaking news, and CNN eventually hired me to do that, and somebody put me on television at some point. I think that person probably now fired or something. But they should be at least. No, but I would say in terms of talking to people, I mean, I was outside the Supreme Court today, and you know, there's plenty of people there with megaphones and people, you know, who are coordinated with T-shirts and people who are, you know, part of groups and very able and willing to speak. But I normally like to talk to the folks who were kind of on the sidelines, you know, people who have kind of come to have a look and maybe have brought a homemade sign, or maybe it's they're not these kind of, you know, they don't go protest every day. And I think they're the people you find the most interesting stories from. And then, as Jason said, I mean, just willing to listen and giving people time to talk and not just waiting. You know, not trying to pressure somebody into just saying what you want to file that's going to fit the story you have in your head, but let's see how it goes. And I think just giving people time. And I will say, don't ever do the annoying thing which happened to me today, was when I was speaking to somebody who was great, and then another journalist saw that we were getting good stuff and just came right up to her after we spoke to her. Don't do that. But or maybe do. I don't. You know, you got to do what you got to do. But yeah, it is listening to people.
Yeah, it really is. I want to get back to some of the student questions. This is from a student researcher who's studying QAnon and Stop the Steal. Lorcan, I believe is your name. I'm sorry, I can't read it. But this balance, whether it's here domestically or overseas. Jason, how do we cover and hold extremist groups accountable through journalism without giving these same actors oxygen in the mainstream press that could help their cause?
Well, that's an incredible question that I don't think we've come up with a good answer for yet. You know, by simply calling them out and writing about misinformation and kind of conspiracy theorists, you're inevitably repeating that problem and giving it a new life. I've been following the case of slight tangential shift, but of Brittany Griner, the WNBA basketball player who's being held in Russia. I don't talk about the charges against her when I write about her or when I speak about her on television, simply because the act of repeating charges that have not been substantiated, not been verified, I'm doing the Russians' job for them.
And that's from a sovereign government. That's not a marginal.
Exactly. As of today, this afternoon, the State Department said that Brittany Griner is being wrongfully detained by the Russian government. That's a political euphemism for being held hostage, right? So, you know, I think that it's really important that we be very cautious when we call these things out. I think, you know, labeling misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories when we report on them has to be more pronounced and more visible. But unfortunately, we can't just ignore these things out of existence. So I don't know. I'd like to hear what Donny has to think.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question we kind of deal with every day. I mean, I would say that, you know, I followed QAnon for a very long time as part of my job, but we never reported on it for years. You know, it started in 2017 and we were keeping an eye on it. And I speak pretty much every day with our standards team. And for a very long time, even throughout a lot of 2020, you know, QAnon would come up, different stories, and I would say, I'm still not sure. This seems just so crazy and unhinged that I don't know. I don't think we need to report on it. And then, you know, lo and behold, in the space of a few weeks, you saw Trump kind of winking and nodding at it at a NBC town hall in the weeks before the election. And I think I was wrong, frankly, in terms of being, I think I let it kind of go to the point where maybe we should have called it out earlier. But, you know, it's very difficult to get those things right. I think to what Jason says is, you know, what we try and do in our reporting is we try to kind of make a fruit sandwich, you know, to tell the person at the beginning, by the way, the next paragraph, the belief that they have is BS, and then kind of reminding the person again after it. But you ultimately, I guess, you are platforming them in some way. And sometimes these groups, when they see they're being covered by the mainstream media, they use it as a weapon, again, to say, you know, see, they're saying this, so we must be right. But that, I don't think, should be a reason that we shouldn't report on it, because, you know, you'd never report on anything then, I guess.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to ask you both. You know, I think on World Press Freedom Day, in the midst of a war in Ukraine, it's very easy to note the importance of the press and, you know, why we do this and why people want to get into this industry. But at the same time, we are in difficult times in the press in terms of the faith that the audience has in us. And, you know, a lot of that really comes to a fore during a political year, which this is. So, Jason, what work do you think that we can do to regain some of the trust that we've lost from the audience?
So one of the things that I've been noticing in the attacks on journalists in the United States and other countries is a real dehumanizing element, right? The way that we are talked about on social media, in some horrific cases, the way journalists have been murdered, and there's almost never any accountability in these cases. We don't deserve that. That's not anything that anybody should have to face. But I think that we as journalists have to do a better job of maintaining our own sense of humanity and that of the stories that we cover, right? Something that Donny talked about earlier. I mean, I think the folks at some of these political rallies just want to be taken seriously, right? And I think that it's incumbent on us to hear people out, to report on what it is that they see happening in the world, whether it's accurate or not, and maintain lines of communication. Because if we don't, we're in for even more trouble.
Tony, any advice?
I guess just really echoing what Jason said is that, you know, so many, I think there can be a tendency sometimes when, you know, reporters in DC or New York go out into the country. It's almost described in ways as if it's, you know, a David Attenborough you know,
documentary.
Yeah, and it's whereas, like, you know, we are all people at the end of the day, without sounding too cliche and cheesy about it. And I think I do think a lot of it is how reporters approach parts that might not be the metropolitan areas and things like that, about how you approach talking to people, how you approach covering it, and kind of just, you know, trying to don't look down your nose at anyone.
Absolutely. On that note, we have to leave it there. Thank you both for your thoughts, your insights, for you all for coming out tonight. I would ask, if you're interested, you can register for more of these virtual events, and when we have them in person as well, at cnn.com/citizen. We will be holding another one tomorrow afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That topic is Roe versus Wade. What happens next? Thanks so much for coming out.
Thank you.